questions so far regarding any of that? Okay, great. And so we are now moving on from our first unit on secondary sources, or as I like to refer to them, stuff to help you find the law. That's a technical term, stuff. And we are now moving on to the law. And what we are going to look at quite a lot as we talk about the various sources of the law is this chart on the sources. And those of you who come in a little late, make sure to pick up the handouts, especially the three that we're going to talk about. You can pick up your workshops at the break. And one of those handouts that I'm asking you to pick up is also up here on the screen, in this chart of the law. So essentially, we are looking at the laws established by our government, and again, not to get philosophical because I'm sure I am getting this mostly wrong, but the whole concept of democracy, of the laws established by the consent of the governed. So we elected these people, some of these people, to essentially pass laws by which we all agree to abide, and that's what you will be spending your career, if you spend your career as a lawyer, interpreting and helping people with. So, of course, you need to find all of this law. And as all of you, of course, already know, that our government and those various people and bodies that establish that law is set forth by our Constitution, and that gets us to our chart. So just to help you understand this chart, and by the way, there's a lot in this, and I understand there's a lot of words, and it's pretty filled up and maybe even a little complex. But if you understand what's in this chart, you are probably about 50% the way there to understanding what you need to know about researching the law. So I'm going to go into some detail, a lot of which you already know, either from 9th grade civics or constitutional law, whenever you took that in law school, and everywhere, and, well, everywhere in between. Okay, so to start, so our first column, the description, basically tells you what we're going to be looking at in the second and third column, and obviously the second and third column. Second column, we'll be talking about federal sources of the law. In the third column, we'll be talking about New York State and the municipalities that are established by the state. And you can generalize from New York State to other states as well. So today, we are going to focus on federal. And next week, we'll talk about state and municipal. Okay, so first row, as I mentioned, so we have the description. So, of course, I just mentioned the Constitution, which establishes the structure of our government. Obviously, federal, as you already know, the U.S. Constitution does that, and the U.S. Constitution does that in the three branches. Article 1 is our first row, legislative. Article 2, of course, second row, executive. And Article 3, judicial. And we'll, again, be going into details on each of this. So for the first row, legislative, of course, we're talking about, on the federal realm, Congress, the House and the Senate. We will be getting to the second row, probably, well, actually, definitely not till after break, when we talk about the executive branch, of course, the president, and more specifically, the agencies and the regulations that are promulgated by those agencies, and of course, what must be your favorite as law students, the judicial branch, and cases that you've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years. So as I said, we're going to focus today on the federal column, the federal branch, or federal jurisdiction, rather, and we are focusing on the first row, the legislative branch, and specifically Congress. But a lot of what we talk about today with regard to the federal legislative branch will apply to states as well, as we'll talk about next week. Okay. So let's take a look at this first box, And again, you might find it more clear to look at the handout rather than the screen. So the legislature, just generally, and again, it's true for federal and state, just generally, what the legislature does, you know, we elect them and they go and they sit wherever they sit and they talk about ideas and then they pass laws that we've all agreed to abide by, whether we like them or not. Those laws generically are known as session laws, sometimes also referred to as slip laws. You may still see that reference. That comes from way back when, I don't even think I can find an example of, but before the internet, when slip laws were issued in something that looked kind of like this, and they got sent out to all us libraries that subscribed. And you will still see that reference occasionally online, actually. They still call them slip laws. And those session laws tend to be organized chronologically, not surprisingly. As the legislature passes it, they give them typically a year and then, you know, whatever number within that year. And as I hope you all saw from our screencast, the force comes in and helps us find and research and understand this legislation using the force, of course, being codification, putting it in a subject arrangement and letting us know what's in force today, not just what happened 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. Okay. So that's generally the sources of the law as it starts out for the legislative branch. As some of you might remember, as we move to talk specifically about federal materials, how that applies, as you can see on the chart, is that generic session law in the federal world is known as our hero of our screencast, the public law. Okay, so can anybody remind us from the screencast on what planets our public law lives, our hero? In other words, where are they published? Right. USCAN's one, absolutely.
Congress.
Just shout it out.
USC.
Statutes at large is the other planet or source. So we talked about codification, the force coming in, and the planets, the statutes at large is the official source. We'll get to the USC in a moment. That's where the magic of codification occurs. Library of Congress is where you might find it. They actually don't publish it. The publishers are the GPO, not something you need to worry about. And of course, the unofficial source, as we mentioned, is USCAN, the unofficial planet, if you will. I tried to have a little fun with the screencast, anyway. Okay. So one of the other handouts you have, and what I've tried to do is to make your lives a little easier and printed out the basics of what we're going to talk about in terms of what you want to think about with regard to the sources and how federal law is published. And so that is the handout here. Federal statutes are the story how federal law is published. And we're going to go through and look more specifically at the details at that. And the reason for looking at those details is so that you have a better understanding for research purposes. So as we can see, once upon a time, as we saw, our hero, the president, signs a bill, and we'll talk about how that bill came to be in a couple of weeks. And that bill becomes a law, and as we just discussed, that law in the federal realm is known as a public law. So the way we get to know that public law. Here on congress.gov, so a government website, lists for us public laws, and we'll be looking more at congress.gov next time. But here is the reverse chronological list of the public laws passed in the 115th Congress. We are now in the 115th Congress. as you can see from our story handout. The 115th Congress started in 2017, and we'll go through the end of this year. Congress obviously lasts 2 years. Anybody guess or know why? It's how long the House of Representatives terms are. Exactly. So what we see here, as I said, are a reverse chronological order. So the most recent public law to be signed by the President is numbered 115-122, 115 because of the Congress, and 122, as you could probably surmise from this list, because it's just the 122nd public law to be signed into law in the 115th Congress. So pretty basic. And it even has its name, the Alex, I'm not going to pronounce that right, Diekman Peak Designation Act. And as you can see, the various names of the act, if you were to go to congress.gov and scroll through. So that's how public law is numbered. Now, just to reinforce how that Congress numbering works, and this is going to be important to understand where a particular law comes from, you can see here I have a listing of how the Congresses work out. Now, you could do the math and work out every 2 years going back to figure out, so what Congress was it in 1974? You could do the math, or you could go to this chart and make your life much easier. So you can see the first Congress obviously started back in 1789, and then counting through. So if we were interested in 1974, we would discover that that is the 93rd Congress. And that will become relevant shortly, I promise. Okay. Any questions so far? Hopefully pretty straightforward. All right. So as we said, the public laws, one planet they live on, is the statutes at large, or one source they're published in, if we're going to say it the proper way. And another one is USCAN. So let's take a closer look at those publications so that we can get to know our public law a little bit better. And that's what this fat handout, I'll be with you in just a second, that's what this fat handout is for. I did this rather than put it up on the screen because we're going to be looking at some of the details. So hopefully this will make it easier for you to see those details. You had a question, Matt.
Not to take you off on a tangent, but what's a private law?
A private law applies to a particular individual or set of individuals. It doesn't apply to all of us.
Thank you.
Okay, so you may or may not recognize page 1 of our walkthrough handout from our screencast. And in fact, I brought up some show and tell. Yes, we do travel with books now and again. So this is what the statutes at large actually looks like up close and personal. If in the old days you were going to need to look at this, it's now online in PDF all over the place, so I'm not sure you would have a great opportunity to need this, but it's always, I think, good to put it in a little bit of context. So I shall pass this around, so if you're interested, you can look at it yourself. If not, just pass it around and I'll pick it up at the end. But as you can see on page 1, that's what the title page of the book that Amy is looking at looks like. And it's telling us that it is volume 88 of the statute at large. So if you look on the spine, you'll see 88. And it's telling us that it contains public laws 93-246 through 93-446. So if we were interested in, say, 93-406, which we will be, and you'll see why in just a moment, obviously that's where we would find it in that range. So let's turn the page. And let's get to know our hero, Public Law 93-406, a little bit better. And I'm sure you will all be very shocked to see, as you read Section 1, a little bit down below all my scribbled arrows, that Section 1 of this Act may be cited as the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, our friend ERISA. Shock of shocks, right? Okay, so our hero also has a number and a name. And so we can see from those handy-dandy arrows labeled number 1, our hero, Public Law 93-406, appears in volume 88 of Statutes at Large, abbreviated STAT. And the first page of our hero appears on page 829, number 2 on the right-hand side, top of the page. So, as you might imagine, our hero Statutes at Large site is going to be, you all know citations? Volume, go.
93.
Volume, what volume were you in? 88? What's the abbreviation? Stat? And what's the page? 829. No trick questions. Sometimes obvious ones, hopefully, but no trick questions. Okay. And you'll see a little handy-dandy arrow a little bit further down on the right-hand side where you might find the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 is in 29 U.S.C. 1001. We will be talking about that translation and transition in detail. So another aspect of our hero 93-406, ERISA, is that it has subject areas, but it calls those subject areas titles. That word title is used in a couple of different contexts and in my humble opinion can get confusing. And the best way I know of to avoid that confusion is just to ask yourself, are we talking about an act or a public law, which is basically another name for an act, where it's the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. So title is one place you'll find it. We'll also be seeing the word title in codes when we start looking at codes. But basically it means the same thing. It just means subject area. So it's just which context you're using that term in. So we're, of course, using it for the moment in the Act, in ERISA. So Title I is just the subject area of protection of employee benefit rights. And it's, again, given a number, Title I. And then below that, we see our ever useful table of contents. So we see Section 2. Section 1 is the short title, which we just read. Section 2 through 4 is a bunch of different things that might be of interest, and then it skips numbers for whatever reason. I actually don't know why, but it skips the numbers to Section 101. And then we see some of the substance of Title I, Protection of Employee Benefits Rights. So turning to page 3, we see more sections. I didn't copy every single page of our Hero the Act because I did want to save a few trees. So we skipped a couple of pages of the table of contents till we got till the end of Title I, looking at the last of those sections, and it turns out the last section is a section 514 called Effect on Other Laws. Remember that number, we'll be coming back to it. Okay, so we're now done with subject area or Title I. We now move to subject area or Title II, which is amendments to the Internal Revenue Code. So can anybody guess if can anybody guess where we will, in what title we'll find that in the U.S. Code? And I know I haven't gone over this yet, so if this would just be a good guess on your part. It's not meant as a trick question. Like I said, no trick questions. 26. We'll see that in just a moment. Okay, so looking at Title II. And why do you say 26, actually?
Well, 26 is taxes.
26 is tax, and some of us jump ahead a little bit, which is good. You're using the tools to. Yeah, we are on this page. So, does it say Title 26? I don't think it says.
26 USC.
Well, it does on page 4. Actually, it does on page 5. Anyway, let's not argue pages. So we're looking at Title II. And for those of you who are a little bit lost about why we're talking about Title 26, I promise you it hopefully will come clear in a moment. If it doesn't, then raise your hand. So Title II, a totally different subject area, tax, no longer protection of employee rights, and more sections of the Act. So again, we skip numbers for some unknown reason, and we start with Section 1011, 1012, and it goes on. Turning to page 4. Right, I want to make sure I haven't skipped pages on you. Yeah, turning to page 4, we see the end of the table of contents of our Hero 93-406, which turns out there are 4 titles we can see at the top of the page. And then we finally get to the actual act, to the text of the act. So Title 1, Protection of Employee Benefits Rights, Subtitle A, and we see Section 2. We already saw Section 1, which told us the title was Employee Retirement. We see Section 2, and we see a handy-dandy little note on the left-hand side, 29 U.S.C. 1001. That's telling us where we will find Section 2 in the U.S. Code. So we'll find it in Title 29, again, use of that word title in 2 different contexts. So Title 29 of the U.S. Code, Section 1001, will contain the text that we see here for Section 2 of our Hero Public Law 93-406. Any questions so far? So let's turn the page to page 5. Section 3 of our Hero 93-406. And no, I'm not going to go through all 514 sections, I promise you. But Section 3 is worth looking at because it's the definition sections. And as I like to say, law is words. Not very grammatical, I know, but I think very true. What we are doing as lawyers is interpreting the words of the law. And if you have a section in the law that tells us this is what these words mean legally, this is the law of what these words mean, you want to look at that, right? I can't promise you every single definition section is going to give you useful information, but if you see a definition section, you want to scan it and decide whether or not it's useful. So, as I say in the right-hand column in my chicken scratch, always good to check definition sections. So let's turn to page 6. So page 6, we see that section 514 that I promised you we'd come back to, and it's got the not very useful title of Effect on Other Laws, so it really, I don't think, tells me what it's about. Some titles of the some names, I should call them names and not use the confusing word title. Some names of the section do tell us what it's about, but this one I think not so great. But on the right-hand side, you see that notation that this particular section 514 appears in 29 U.S.C. 1144. Does that ring a bell for anybody? You remember what that was? Do we remember seeing a section? Let's see if I can pull it up quickly. No, not that one. Remember when we were looking at secondary sources? And we did our search, liability HMO, and maybe we limited to a particular type so we didn't get quite so many, and we found that great ALR article. Is this ringing a bell? And as we read through and we looked at the scope, we learned that ERISA or the preemption section, the footnote is in here somewhere, is in actually 29 U.S.C. 1144. Is that the one? Nope, that's not the one. I think it was footnote 7. There we go. So we talk preemption clause. Again, I'm not sure. So we got the reference to 29 U.S.C. 1144. Does that now ring a bell? Okay, you're at least agreeing with me. So, and as we can see from on page 6, our section that we've been talking about regarding ERISA preemption originated, we now know, in section 514 of Public Law 93-406. And we're going to see that a different way in a little while. And that occurs on page 897 of volume 88 of Statutes at Large. Everybody following that sentence from what we're looking at on page 66? Okay, moving on to page 7. And for those of you who haven't lived in the world of tax, this is where you would find out that Title II, Amendments to the Internal Revenue Code, that we were talking about just a little while ago, winds up in Title 26 of the U.S. Code. So we can see Subtitle A, Section 1011, basically adds to the U.S. Code Section 410 of Title 26 of the USC, and I know that by looking on the left in that little notation in the left-hand margin. And you have a handy-dandy arrow, and notice that this is a different U.S. Code title, Title 26. So we have one act, our hero 93406, that has sections that are put in different parts, different titles, different subject areas of the U.S. Code, Title 29 and Title 26, which we now know is the Internal Revenue Code. Any questions so far? Okay. So that's statutes at large. Let's turn the page and get to know the other planet where our hero lives, and of course that's USCAN, United States Code, Congressional and Administrative News, and no, I'm not going to say that again or expect you to remember that. If you remember USCAN, you're doing just fine. And the reason I mention USCAN is that you will see citations to it. You probably have seen citations to it in law review articles. A lot of times cite to USCAN for a variety of reasons. Actually, did I send around USCAN? Ha, shame on me. I sent around USCAN, and this is statutes at large. Oh dear. Anyway, they look just the same, so I wouldn't blame you for being confused. So I'll send them both around so you can see the difference. Here, I'll start with you since you're right here. Anyway, so USCAN is basically the unofficial source for public laws. USCAN is not numbered by volume, but by year. So if you did, for whatever reason, have to find USCAN in print in one of those heavy volumes that look just like statutes at large, you would want to look for the year. So you need to know the year of your public law, which we now know is 1974. And you can see on page 8 that our Hero 93406, our particular public law is in volume 1. And you'll see on page 2 that it looks just, page, we don't have a page number, so that's page 9 got cut off, the one after 8, obviously. It looks just the same. We see our public law number, we see the table of contents. We'll talk a little bit about how USCAN differs from statutes at large when we talk about legislative history, but pretty much for our purposes right now, it does just the same thing. So if you turn to page 10, you'll see it lists in the table of contents our section 514. It then goes to Title II. And turning to page 11, it starts with the text of the Act. So section 2, and section 2 actually will be of interest when we talk about legislative history, findings, and declaration of policy. And we'll come back to that when we talk about legislative history. And then on page 12, sure enough, we see that same section 514 that we've been focusing on with regard to preemption. So for our purposes, public law, whether it's in statutes at large or USCAN, it does the same thing. One's official, so the only reason you want to know the difference is for citing purposes. Any questions? And just to be as clear as I possibly can with regard to this use of the word title in two different contexts, on page 13, you will see the list of the titles of the U.S. Code. So we talked about titles within Public Law 93406, so there was protection of employee benefit rights, and there was amendments to Internal Revenue Code, so that's one use of title, again, subject area within ERISA, within the Act. Now we see the other use of the word title, how codes can be organized. and not just the U.S. code, but a lot of state codes as well. And page 13, you see the list, and they also are numbered. So we see, if you go through, for instance, Title 18 is Crimes and Criminal Procedure. I know a couple of you are interested in that. We've already discussed Title 26 is the Internal Revenue Code. So if you didn't know before, now you can see it here. And Title 29, our title, remember we're interested in 29 U.S.C. 1144, our title, not surprisingly, I think, is labor, because we're talking about employee benefit rights. So that, I hope, makes some amount of sense.
Do they fit everything they do into one of these titles?
Pardon me?
Do they fit everything they do into one of these titles? Or is there like a miscellaneous?
All of the federal
All public laws
end up in one of these titles. There's certain parts of the public laws that, for instance, budgetary law, when Congress figures out the budget, all of the details of the budget don't wind up in the U.S. code. So there's not every part of every public law winds up, but the main, I don't know how to describe this, the important parts, the parts that you need to go back to. And they update this, and they sometimes add titles, they sometimes reorganize titles. Any other questions? Okay, so let's do a quick workshop just to make sure you all understand this, because understanding how these public laws are structured and numbers is going to make understanding how to research them a whole lot easier. So if you would all go on to the TWEN site, and when you get to the TWEN site, go to Review Questions and Polling, you should see Statutes Review Question 1. And go ahead and answer the question. The generic name for a public law is session law, true or false? Should not take you too long. Just give me a wave when you're done. Okay. So, of course, the generic name for public law is true. And if we finish the poll, let's view our results. So a few people were a little confused about that, but overall did pretty well. And we can see all sorts of funky graphs. I'm not sure that tells us a great deal. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is make the second question available for you. And the second question, you should now see, if you refresh your TWEN screen, the second question asks you, Public Law 111-148 was passed in which Congress? Give me a wave when you're done. Do you try to hide all your enthusiasm? Okay. So somebody shout out the answer. 111. Good. And see how we did. All right, everybody. Getting on board here. Excellent. And one more for the moment. And TWEN does not let me change the order of these, so that's why we have to go around this so I can do this in the right order. And so question number 3 should now be available to you on TWEN if you refresh. The best description of the statutes at large is official source, public laws organized by subject, official source of public laws organized chronologically, predecessor of the U.S. Code, or a big heavy set absolutely no relevance to existence. Give a wave. Wait, let's see if I can do this straight without answering. Yeah, I can. How nice. So let's see what we got. Okay, so official source organized chronologically. So I can understand a couple people being a little confused because we went through that quickly. So statutes at large just each year comes out. The volumes are numbered, but it comes out each year with a few volumes. Okay, excellent. We'll do a few more questions in a little while because first let's look at our section 1144. I'm going to go here on Lexis. We'll be looking at both Lexis and Westlaw and a little bit of Bloomberg, so you'll all hopefully get comfortable. But I want you to get a sense of a little bit why all this public law numbering stuff, why you should care. And why you should care is it's part of you will see it in the history of whatever section you are looking at. So if here we have our section 291144, our preemption section here on Lexis. If I just go down to history, what we see is exactly the information that we have been talking about. So we see the very first entry is where section 1144 originated. Now we just went through my copied handout, walkthrough, and we discovered our hero is Public Law 93406, and we know that it was, well, we saw it was in that first Title I, Section 514, and we learned that the planet it lives on is Volume 88. We now know STAT stands for Statutes at Large, and the actual page that we find 514, if you flip back, you'd see it's page 897. Now, what this history tells us, and as you may remember from the screencast, is, of course, time did not stop for ERISA in 1974, or for Section 514 of ERISA in 1974, when it was passed. Things changed. Life went on. You all were born. So a lot happened since then, and ERISA got amended. It got changed. So what this history is telling us is how that happened. So we see this all-important semicolon. Believe it or not, a semicolon can be really, really important and useful, because what it's telling us in this history is here's where ERISA first was enacted. The semicolon tells us, and it was amended by, so it's and amended by Public Law 97-473, which happened in 1983. It tells us the sections, actually a couple of sections here, 301, 302. It gives us the statutes at large site, 96, stat 2611, and another page. And then we see the semicolon. So that tells us, and amended by 1984, Public Law 98-397, Section 104. We find that on the Planet 98, Volume 98 of the Planet Statutes at Large, on page 1436. The semicolon tells us, I'm doing this for a reason, humor me for a sec.
Amended again.
And amended by, amended again, either one. 1986, Public Law 99-72. Here's our section number. Here's our Statutes at Large site. And one more time with feeling, everybody, the semicolon tells us, and amended. Great. 1989, Public Law 101-293. Okay, this is not meant to be a trick question, but it is also not an easy one. When was our section 1144 last amended by Congress? Can you see it? Make it a little bigger. How do you know that?
Semicolon date?
It's and amended by the last semicolon date. Everybody see that? 2006? Now, it may be a little hard to see in the back. And for those of us closer to the front, what's the public law number?
109-280.
109-280. And the statutes at large site?
120, page 1039.
And the section we would find 1144's amendment in public law 109-280?
902F1.
902F1. Okay, you want to know how to read this history statement, because when you need to look back at the history, this will be how you do it. Okay. The other reason you need to understand what all this numbering stuff means is that occasionally you will get a reference to a public law. Now, what tends to happen, so here's a Lexis, on Lexis, we have an article from the New York Times. It's dated January 3rd, 2018, so we're talking relatively recently, right? And if you were interested in the Voting Rights Act, so actually this article is talking about request to check citizenship stirs fears for census. So if we're thinking about the 2020 census getting started, and apparently this article is how the Justice Department requested that more information on citizenship be included in the census. And they are claiming that the basis for this is Section 2 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It's not telling you where the current law is that they're interpreting. The Justice Department is interpreting the current version of the Voting Rights Act as reported by this article. If this were important to you for whatever reason, you would need to figure out how to find this as it exists today, not find Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And the way you do that is in what I call a translation table. It's actually called Table 3. Why is that not coming up? So Table 3, it's called a Table 3 tool, and as you may or may not be able to see, it's at the House of Representatives website. The best way to find this, there's a link on our class web links on the Twin page, or you can just Google House of Representatives, if you remember, Table 3 tool, or you can also do U.S. Code translation table. So if you know your public law number, you can use the translation table. So if we know for our hero, our public law number is 93406, and it was passed in 1974. So I click on 1974, and then I find 93406. And what I see is the translation between the public law section and the U.S. Code section. You will see a lot of references to the Public Law Act section number. Even though they are talking about the law today, they might refer back, like that New York Times article did, to the Act section, even though the Act was, what, 1965 was, I can't do the math, 40, 50 years ago? Maybe more? More than 50 years ago. Anyway, you will need to then figure out, how do I find this today? I can't tell you how many times I've had attorneys, experienced attorneys, come to me at the reference desk and say, I need to find this. How do I find this? And they have no idea that they are looking at the Act section citation, and they're looking in the U.S. Code. Now, they're looking in the right place, but they don't have the right information. The way you get the right information is this translation table. So, and I think the table also gives you a great representation, and I'll try to make it a little bigger so you can see it in the back, of how that works. So in 93406, Act Section 1 appears in Title 29 of the U.S. Code. In Section 1001, and NT stands for note. As we already saw in our walkthrough in the first couple of pages, Act Section 2 of Public Law 93406 also appears in Title 29 of the Code in the regular part of Section 1001. Going through, you can see where these different sections of the Act appeared in the U.S. Code. You can also see that actually our public law wound up in different titles and different subject areas of the U.S. Code. So a certain subsection of Section 111 of 93-406 wound up in Title 18, the Crimes and Criminal Procedure Act. So there's some criminal aspect to 93-406. Scrolling down a little further, we'd find references to Title 26, as we already know, because we looked at Public Law 93-406, there are all sorts of tax provisions in there. So Public Law 93-406 got separated out, got codified. This is where the force finally comes into play. Got codified and put into subject arrangement, allowing us to A, be able to find statutes on a particular subject, and B, find them as they exist today. So this section, if for whatever reason, we found a reference to Section 514, we could go here to the translation table, and now we already know this, but we could find the reference to 1144. So let's take our example. If I'm reading this New York Times article and I'm really interested, it's like, wait a minute, what does that law read today? Is the Justice Department remotely accurate in their reading of the Voting Rights Act as it exists in 2018? So I don't have a public law number here, right? And news articles aren't really going to give you a public law number. They're going to refer to it by its name. It's also referred to as a popular name, which kind of makes sense. That's how we refer to it popularly. So sure enough, our same website from the House of Representatives also has a popular name tool. So we can go to the popular name tool and we can look up the Voting Rights Act. Now you can click on V or scroll down. I'm actually going to use Control F and then just click through because I find that easier. And sure enough, here's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'll center it just a little bit. And so I learned that the Voting Rights Act of 65 is Public Law 89-110. I know it starts in Title 52 U.S. Code 10301 et sec. Anybody remember what et sec means? And following. So I know the Voting Rights Act is starting at this section, but I don't know what Section 2 is. I could guess maybe it's 10302, but I don't really know. Why guess? I'm going to go back to my translation table and just click back to the beginning. And I'm going to go to 1965. And yes, it's possible you could Google Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and figure out what the USC site is. It might work, and you might be able to do it like that, or it might take you 10 or 15 minutes. Whereas this is going to take me less than that to explain it to you, and once you understand it, it'll take you a couple of minutes. So we got to 1965 in our Table 3.2 in our translation table. And rats, I clicked too quickly. So there's 1965, and we said 89-110, I think. And Section 2 of the Act, turns out Section 2 is 10301. Section 1 was some other section. So I wouldn't have guessed right if I had gone to 10302, although I would have been pretty close. It might have been able to figure out, but why do all that figuring and guessing? I can go straight to this. So everybody understand what I did. I took the popular name, I looked it up in the popular name table, I got my public law, I went to the public law translation table, also called the Table 3 tool, went to the year, public law number, and here's my translation. Questions? Okay, so let's go back to our polling on TWEN and answer a few more questions about what we just talked about. So I will have to make those questions available for you because Westlaw doesn't make it easy for me. And let's make poll available. Okay, so you should now see question 4. if you have the name of an act, for example, the Affordable Care Act, what is the best way to find it in the U.S. Code? Give me a wave when you're done. Okay. Think I saw anybody still? Okay, so somebody answer the question. What's the best way to find it in the Affordable Care Act? Popular name table. Okay, to look in the statutes at large, you would have to have the statutes at large site, which in the question as it was asked, you don't. So a much easier way, popular name table. And actually, one thing I will say about Googling, if you do have a popular name, Wikipedia actually is pretty good about giving you the public law number, so that's not a bad way either. But I personally prefer the popular name table just because I know I'm going to find it there, and by the time I've Googled, I could have gone to the popular name table and found the information. Okay. So that was question 4. Let's try question 5. Okay, you should be able to see it now. If you have, again, the name of the act, for example, the Affordable Care Act, what is the best way to find its public law number? So, how to find it in U.S. Code, how to find its public law number. Wave when you're done. More time. And the answer is, once again, the popular name table. Again, you don't have the statutes at large information. We don't know the year. We don't have the stat at large site. So popular name table, again, Google might also work for that as well. Okay, a couple more. And these will be slightly more challenging. Well, a couple of them will be slightly more challenging, I think. Okay, so now I'm asking you to go to the popular name table or tool. You can Google it, popular name House of Representatives, or you can copy and paste the web address that I have here on Twin, and find the public law number for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Wave when you're done. Who's still working? Okay, so let's see what we got. Well done. Very well done. So the public law number 88-352 through the popular name. Anybody do something else to find it, or did y'all go to the popular name? Which is, however you find the information, it is good. Okay, So just to make sure again, we're all following along. Okay, question 7 is now available. The section number you are interested in is section 2 of the public law. Then it will be numbered section 2 of the U.S. Code. True or false? All done? Anybody still thinking? That one I think is pretty straightforward. Let's find out. Okay, no. Okay, so a couple of people. Again, the numbering system is different. That's what that translation table hopefully is telling us. So here's the Voting Rights Act example. Section 2 is going to be whatever number it is in the U.S. Code. The numbering system is never the same, and that's what attorneys get confused about. They get the section number and they're looking at section 2 in the code when they're getting the references section 2 in the Act. That's one reason why I elaborate on this for as much as I have, because I know that that's an area of confusion. So for those of you who are a little confused, if you are still confused, please ask either now or later. Otherwise, let's move on to the last question for this particular workshop. I'll make it available in just a sec. Okay, so I'm asking you now to go to the translation table, also known as the Table 3 tool, and I give you the web address on Twen. There's also a link in the class web links. So copy and paste or do whatever works, and then find the U.S. Code section for section 1563A of Public Law 111-148 from 2010. So you need to go to the Table 3 tool and find that the U.S. Code section for that particular section of Public Law 111-148. Again, wave when you're done. Anybody need more time? No, everybody's good. All right, let's take a look and see what we got. Okay, so 300 G-21. If you didn't understand how to get that, if you're willing to ask the question now, I can't quite guess where you got confused. So if you're willing to share, if not, come ask me later on. But again, that's the translation table, and we went to, so this Table 3 tool, if you get to this point, is under this Other Tables. So I'm just getting to the home page of that. Again, to review, so when we knew it was 2010, and we knew it was 111-148, and then the number, just scrolling down, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't have it memorized, so it's 1563A. so back here, just scrolling down to 1563A, and yes, I could do Control F, but this will probably work better. So 1563A, Title 42, so Section 300, double G-21. So for those of you who are a little confused. Okay, so we have got to know, up close and personal as they used to say, our hero, the public law. Why don't we take a break and come back at 5:20, and we will see how the force gets applied with codification. All right, so any questions regarding our hero, Public Law 93-406, the various planets on which you will find our hero, the numbering, how to translate into the U.S. Code? All right, so we're going to spend the rest of the evening talking about the code and why in particular annotated codes are going to be your BFF. But first, let's get to know the U.S. Code a little bit better. So we're going to go back to our walkthrough handout, so back where we left off on page 13, where we were looking at the titles of the U.S. Code. And of course, the titles being the subject area, in this context, the code, rather than a public law or an act. And of course, our particular section of interest appears in Title 29, the labor title. So the U.S. Code, as you may remember from our screencast, of course, is where we will find the current our hero as the sections exist today. So we've been looking at Public Law 93-406 and Section 514 of that, but that was back in 1974, and we went through and saw as it was amended by with our semicolon. It was amended a whole bunch of times, but for our client, remember our client? She needs to know, or rather you need to know to represent her, in part, what the preemption section says today. And so that's what, in part, why the U.S. Code is why the code's going to be your friend, in that you will see it as I said, as it exists today, but we'll also talk about the features of the annotated code in just a little bit. But in looking on page 14, the U.S. Code is the official publication of the code. And we are looking at the most recent edition, which is the 2012 edition. And hopefully, as bibliographically aware lawyers, you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, 2012? That was a long time ago. I need to know 2018. Well, for reasons I actually don't know, it was decided when the system came about to publish the U.S. Code that the code would come out, each edition would come out every 6 years. So you do the math, we're due for a new one this year, but the one we currently have is the 2012 edition. And this is what it looks like in the flesh or in the print. And this is the right volume, so I shall pass this around. So if you're interested, you can see what the 2012 edition looks like in print. So, as we all, I think, can agree, we need something more recent, and as it turns out, they do understand that as well, so they come out with supplements. So the most recent supplement to be published by the government publishing office, is supplement number 4, as you can see on page 15. And supplement number 4, again, as bibliographically aware lawyers, we are looking at the dates, and we see that supplement 4 covers between 2013 and January 6, 2017. So it gets us up to exactly a year ago today. So still not entirely up to date, and I'll pass around the supplement. And so that you can see if it, oh good, it didn't log me out, but it probably will. So here you see the PDFs of exactly what I'm passing around, and some of you may already know this. So we find the U.S. code on Hein Online in PDF amongst other places, and we can see the various editions going back to when the U.S. code started in its current version, which is back in the early part of the 20th century. And if we go to the 2012 edition, as I mentioned, that's the most recent, and we would find Title 29 here in Hein. And then if we scroll down far enough, we would see the supplements. So just so you can get a sense of what the supplements look like each year, the supplements come out. And the U.S. government being a little bit behind, as it sometimes is with publication, as we can see, got us up to a year ago. So in comes good old U.S. entrepreneurship to fill the breach, and we have the unofficial code, well, two unofficial codes called the U.S. Code Annotated, USCA, and the U.S. Code Service, USCS. They are published by commercial publishers. So the USCA is published by, well, West, now Thomson Reuters, but we're all familiar with Westlaw, so surprise, surprise, we'll find the USCA on Westlaw, and the USCS is now published by Lexis. So we have two commercial publishers, and one reason why these annotated codes, and they're both annotated codes, are our BFF, or our very, very best friends, is that they are far more up to date, even in the print version. And as we will see on Lexis and Westlaw, even more up to date than that. Yeah, no reason why I can't pass these around now. Should you be interested?
If you know that your statute or code section was not amended after the last USC came out, you need to go to the current iteration of the annotated code or even the supplements. Like, for example, we were looking at it before, we saw it was 2006 is the last time they amended, let's just say 1144.
Well, we were looking on Lexis is how we found that out. Okay. So, and the answer is you're looking at a fairly current source, and we will talk about what you want to look for to make sure that you don't have to go beyond 2006. Okay, but before we dive into all the wonderful features of the annotated code, we really should talk about how to find statutes, right? That's ultimately, this is a research course. We're talking about how to find information for research for a client. So we have our client, let me strike the probably. When you are dealing with a complex issue like we are for our client, what do you think the best way is to find what the relevant statutes are, what the relevant code sections are for your client, for our client? Thank you. Secondary sources. What have we been talking about all semester up till now? So as we saw back when we were talking about Westlaw a little while ago, I've got it here somewhere, we were looking at that ALR article that helped us to, well, actually informed us that there was this whole ERISA issue that we had to worry about. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have even known that ERISA existed without reading a secondary source first, whether it's this ALR article or any of the other secondary sources that were useful that we identified when we talked about finding secondary sources. However, that you cannot stop there. Just as you can't stop with Googling, you can't stop with secondary sources, you're still going to want to search in statutes, because this particular ALR article talks about one aspect of our issue. It doesn't talk about all of them. Yes, you want to look at other secondary sources to help you with that, but ultimately you do also want to search the statutes themselves. Now that can turn out to be useful or not, because as we've talked about with our particular statute, so back here in Lexis, the Statutory language can be very particular, very precise, and can be terms that we're not familiar with or know to search. So, for instance, the name of this section is Other Laws. That's not going to do us any good keyword searching, right? And if we were to search through, we actually wouldn't find the word preemption until we got to the outside of the text of the statute. It talks about supersedure. I barely remember how to spell that. Forget about knowing to search that as a keyword, right? So this whole concept of statutes having very particular language is referred to as controlled vocabulary. The legislature sat down and they worked out very precise, specific language, so it says as close as what they mean, but that means that finding general, normal language that we all use, doing keyword searching, can be particularly difficult. So all of that is a long way round of saying you need to go to secondary sources for complex issues, but you also need, once you've learned something about the language, then you need to also search the statutes. So there are a few ways of doing that. Talked about secondary sources, there's keyword searching. You can also look in an index, and sometimes this is going to be great, and sometimes it's not going to be useful at all. So actually, it's much easier to find index on Westlaw. Actually, I'm going to open up another window to show you where the index might be. I actually, as I think I've said before, prefer to look at print indexes. Maybe that's just out of habit and what I'm more comfortable with, and remember, being familiar is not a good reason. But I found even when I have gotten over my familiarity and gone online, it's just clunkier and I wind up getting lost. But here the USCA index is available on Westlaw. If you go to the, as I did, if you go through the browse and get to the USCA, you'll see the index here. And then you do your best, just as you do your best choosing your keyword search to type into Lexis or Westlaw or Google, you do your best to choose terms in the index. It's also possible, other ways of finding relevant statutes we've already talked about. If you already know something, so if you already know the popular name, you already know, obviously if you already know the section, those are other ways. A lot of times, and again, this I'm talking about when you have a fairly complex issue like we do for our client, as well as you're coming to the subject with very little background. As you get more experienced in practice, you'll start to become more comfortable with the relevant statutes in your area. So going through this whole long process that we're talking about may be less necessary. Also may be less necessary if you're in a very more straightforward type of issue, or if you're in an area, for instance, that you know isn't statutory. But this is, so I'm talking about for, again, complex issues about which you are less familiar. Okay, so we will talk about now some of the features of the annotated code. Again, what I'm hoping to convince you is your very best friend. That will also help you with finding relevant statutes on the research end. So we will start looking on Westlaw, and then I will show you the features on Lexis and Bloomberg. And we will compare that to the print. Now, the thing about the print and why I'm showing you this is that a lot of attorneys still prefer doing statutory research in print. Not to say that's the right way, but you may find occasionally the print is less confusing because you can look at several statutes at once, because you can have 3 books open in front of you at once. I used to find that way back when the earth was still cooling and I practiced. Going back and forth scrolling between windows would get me lost, but having the books in front of me, I could refer back and forth. Again, I found the print index to be less confusing for the same reasons. So keep that in mind. I realize these days you're more comfortable and it's so much easier to find it online, but that is a possibility. So let's take a look at both. So our section, 29 U.S.C. 1144, here we have on Westlaw. So what are some of the useful tools that will also help us with research? Well, one of them we already know about, the table of contents. And in fact, I would say for statutory research, this is probably the #1 tool I look to. I can't tell you how many times I've done a keyword search. And again, because of that controlled vocabulary problem in statutes, I don't come up with the exact right section, but I may get within the right title or subject area. So maybe I get in the labor title, but I don't get the exact, the section isn't quite right, and I read it's like, that's not quite right, but it's close. Let me look at the table of contents, and I can look up what sections may be relevant. Or maybe I did find a relevant section, but there's more than one. Especially in complex area, very frequently more than one section applies. How many cases have you read where you get referenced by the judge to a bunch of different statute sections? So you can take a look. So we look at the sections closest to ours, or in the same part. And again, depending on the issue, I may want to move up the hierarchy and say, okay, so I looked at the sections in Part 5, what's in Subtitle B? And I may just look around and see. So what I might notice as I go up, so if I go to Subchapter 1, I might notice definitions. So one thing I will do is go up the hierarchy and see if there are any definition sections. Because like I said before, definition sections are always worth looking at. Might not always be relevant, but they're always worth looking at to see if a term is defined within the statute and that definition is important for your issue. Okay, so table of contents definitely up there in importance. And let's take a look now in the print. So if we go to page 16, you see the title page of the book that went around for the USCA. And we see on page 17, again, going to the table of contents, which in this particular volume, coincidentally, is in the beginning of the volume. You'll see because that's on page 2. But that's not always the case, obviously. In the book, it depends on where your particular title or subtitle or chapter, in our case, our chapter is the ERISA starts. And on page 18, you can see, actually, to me, this is an example where the chapter, where the print table of contents is easier to navigate than the online, because I can see in a glance the entire table of contents. So I could scan down or scan up and say, oh, look, maybe I need to look at those fiduciary duties. I kept on running across that in the secondary source. And I don't know about the civil enforcement, but maybe I should look at that. And if I had looked at the earlier page on page 17, I would have noticed the definitions. A little more difficult to find online, and in my opinion. I'm not trying to talk you into going to the print, just hopefully giving you more tools. But let's go to the section in print. So page 19, ta-da, we have our section 1144. And I see up top it's chapter 18, so that's how I would know how to find the table of contents, is just to flip back to the beginning of chapter 18. Okay, and going to page 20, I actually see there's a definition section within section 1144, not just other separate definition sections. So again, same rationale applies to the definitions. And on page 21, what we see are the history, what we saw as history on Lexis on Westlaw. Back to section 1144 here. On Westlaw, it's not called history, it's called credits. But again, that's the public law information with our various amendments, so we can tell how our section has changed over time. So in Lexis it's history, on Westlaw it's credits, and in print it's just the parenthetical after the text of the section. So parenthetical, for lack of a better short term. Okay, below that we see something called historical and statutory notes. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, so not worry about that at the moment. And turning to page, so you see that on page 22 as well. Turning on page 23, we see a reference to regulations. We'll talk about that when we talk about administrative law. But you're starting to see there's lots of information in the annotated code that eventually is going to become useful to us, but again, we'll talk about it later. But finally, on page 23, we do see some information that we'll talk about today that is also useful to us, and that's references to secondary sources. If for whatever reason we got to section 1144 and we're still not understanding it, our annotated code, our BFF, tells us, hey look, here's more explanation, and here's a whole long list of various aspects of this explanation. On page 23, and going to 24 and 25, I highlighted with a handy-dandy arrow one ALR article that could be interesting. Continuing on page 26 and 27, there are forms, there are encyclopedia references on 26, there are forms on 27, there are treatises and practice aids. I feel like a commercial, but wait, there's more. Actually, there is, but we'll get to that. And that continues on 28. And likewise here on Westlaw, it's called, the tab is Context and Analysis. And again, we see basically the same information. Law reviews, different references. You can scroll down and see
How did you get through Westlaw?
Context and Analysis tab. So there's a whole bunch of information here that will help us understand ERISA. Okay. And if that wasn't good enough, so here's the commercial, that late night TV commercial. And if that wasn't good enough, well, I still think the table of contents is the best part, but really close to the table of contents, and you might argue, you could make a convincing argument that it's even as good as the table of contents, are the notes of decisions. And this is why we pay tens of thousands of dollars, and yes, the library does pay tens of thousands of dollars for these annotated codes. And this is one of the main reasons, because these editors of these annotated codes basically did the legal research for us. Because, of course, as you read all those cases you did in first year, second year, and for those of you in third year, and you've seen those cases interpreting the statutes because each side decided, no, the statute should be interpreted this way, no, it should be this way, and the judge decides, nope, this is how the statute's going to be interpreted, and for henceforth, that's the law. Someone did that research for you and found those cases that interpreted your particular section or sections. Now, yes, you can go on Lexis and Westlaw and Google and try to find cases, but someone's done the work for you. Why reinvent the wheel? And not only have they done the work for you, but they've actually tried to make it easier for you to find those cases. So for a section like 29.11.44, there are a lot of cases that are interpreted. By a lot, I mean like hundreds, maybe even like many hundreds of cases, and you certainly don't want to have to look through every single case, even though you found at least those hundreds of cases. So they've given you topic headings for those cases. And that's here in the Notes of Decision tab, and here you see those topic headings. Now I might scroll through and see what topic headings look of interest, but Westlaw, and as I'll show you Lexis, try to make it easy for us. So I can actually search this Note of Decisions tab. So I'm not searching the full text of the cases, I'm searching the actual notes, and I'll show you what the notes look like in just a moment after we do a search. So let's say we're interested in denial of care. So, and when you do this search and notes of decisions, you do need to do a Boolean search. This is not a natural language search. So what this does is this pulls up those notes that uses denial within the same paragraph as care. I could get even more sophisticated and add and health maintenance organization. And let's hope I don't have typos. Yes, no typos. And now I can see where these terms apply. And so I might scroll down and look at my topic headings. And, oh look, here's a whole range of headings about health insurance. So I'm going to take a look at that. And there might be others I want to look at also, but I promise to show you what the notes look like. And what these notes are basically 2 or 3 sentence summaries of the different cases that interpret 1144 that contain the words that I just searched and come under the topic health insurance. So I know that these cases are about health insurance. I also know that the descriptions contain my search terms, which may or may not help me. And of course, this being Westlaw, I get a link to the case. Any questions about notes of decisions? Like I said, but wait, there's more. This is really one of the great features of the annotated code and why it really is your BFF. So let's take a look at notes of decisions in print, if for whatever reason you do wind up using a print code. And by the way, next week when we talk about state statutes, we'll have a workshop where you actually do research in the print, just so you get some experience. So starting on page 28, after we get through our library and references and secondary sources, we see our notes of decisions, and we see the list of topics of those notes. And turning to page 29, if we just scrolled through alphabetically and got to health maintenance, we would see that topic 192 might be of interest. And continuing to scroll, I might also decide, maybe I want to also check out negligence. This is a long list of topics for notes of decisions, but even as long as it is, it wouldn't take that long to sort of scan through in print the whole thing, 5 minutes maybe. So as nice as the searching is, it's sometimes a good idea, either if you're online, to scroll or to scan through in print, in case they're just topics that you wouldn't have thought of to do a search on. So topics 192 and negligence 238 look interesting, so I'm just going to flip through the pages. So if I were in 1144, I would just look on top and find the note number, and I would get to 192, as we see on page 31 of our handout. And I would read about the different notes, the different cases that interpreted 1144 having to do with health maintenance organizations, health insurance, and state regulation and control. And I just see that continued on page 32. Any questions about notes of decisions, about our BFF annotated code on Westlaw or in print, the USCA? Okay, so let's take a quick look at Lexis and Bloomberg, but it pretty much works the same way. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other, I'm just saying they're pretty similar, so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time doing the same thing. So here, as we've seen already, it's what Lexis looks like with regard to the U.S. Code Service. That's what USCS stands for. Also an annotated code, also a BFF. So again, the table of contents, pretty obvious. Also, as you can do this on Westlaw as well, looking at the information at top, which is called the heading information, you could work your way up and look at the various sections that way as well. So however you like to do it, you could view the full table of contents. You could click on any of these links to view that particular portion of the table of contents. And again, extremely, extremely useful. We already looked at the history of Lexis. Again, that's where you find all the public laws that amended our particular section. We also have research references. So instead of context and analysis, it's research references, same concept, secondary sources that help us understand Section 1144. And we definitely have notes of decisions. Lexis calls them case notes. Now, these topic headings are going to be different. Lexis and Westlaw, remember, are competitors. So it's like Coke and Pepsi. They don't share their formulas. So Lexis and Westlaw don't share their topic headings. So you have to scan through and determine which topic headings on Lexis might be of interest in their case notes or notes of decisions. You can also search. And what you're doing here is a little bit different. You're searching the entire document, so not just the case notes, but you can enter a search just like we did. And I'll just search denial/pcare, just save on typing. And it'll take a few seconds. Hopefully not too many seconds. There we go. And this turned out to be kind of useful because denial of benefits, that sounds pretty relevant. So check it out. And as we said, same concept of notes of decisions, couple of sentences with the case. Okay, questions on Lexis? Again, same concept. Bloomberg, similar concept, not as robust as the people in technology like to say. So here we have Section 1144 of Title 29 in Bloomberg. You do have some of the same information. So you have the general info will give us some of the information. Scrolling down, you'll find the credits. Actually, I scrolled too far. Again, they don't give it any names, kind of like the print. Not really great references with regard to secondary sources, but you do have the notes of decisions, which Bloomberg calls smart code, and you get to launch the smart code. Sounds like you're launching a missile or something. And as we did with other annotated codes, we have topic headings, so you can limit by topic heading. And that's Bloomberg's version of the annotated code. Any questions? Okay, so we're done thinking about codes, right? I can sit down and relax. You done? Good heavens, no! We have to update! I warned you I was going to do that. You guys didn't answer. And you have to update, especially in print, but even if you're online. Why do I say that? It may be going back to Westlaw. Matt asked me earlier, since we know that it didn't change since 2006, do we not have to check? And I gave him a sort of, yeah, we still have to check answer. Come on, Westlaw, go back to my document. Oh, that's not what I wanted, is it? There we go. Okay. So there are a couple of things we need to check. It is possible. It's unusual. I will grant you. But we need to update. We need to know what the law is today. If Congress passed, I mean, there were 122 public laws that got passed since the beginning of the 115th Congress. I don't know how many of them were in 2018, but it is possible that something got passed that changed Section 1144 in the last week or two. I mean, couple of weeks ago, we had a major overhaul of the tax code, right? That isn't going to, in 20 seconds, appear in all of the various appropriate sections of the Internal Revenue Code. It's going to take time. What Lexis and Westlaw will do for us, and yet another reason that we pay the tens of thousands of dollars that we pay for them, is it will give us some form of signal. Notice these flags here. You would see a red flag with some sort of notice saying check the public law for changes. Now, as I said, that's very unusual because Lexis and Westlaw are really good. They earn their to an extent, their tens of thousands of dollars by incorporating it pretty quickly, but it's not immediate. So you need to look at that. So what this flag is telling me, proposed legislation. So I don't need to worry about that. That's not law yet. That's proposed. There are lots of proposals that don't make it into law. This other flag is the other reason I need to double check, because not only can laws get changed by the legislature, right, they can get invalidated by the courts. Doesn't even necessarily have to be a Supreme Court, the Supreme Court. So you also want to check the flags to see if a case invalidated your section or invalidated part of your section, or at least the part that matters to you. So here's a flag that's telling me unconstitutional or preempted, prior versions limitation recognized by this New Hampshire Motor Transport v. Road case. So prior version, I'm not sure, but I'm going to double check just to make sure that that case doesn't somehow invalidate, negate the part that I am relying on. The fact that Westlaw interprets it as a yellow flag caution gives me some comfort that I probably don't have to worry about it, but as I'm the one who's representing my client, not Westlaw, I need to read that case to double check. And speaking of reading, I didn't mention in the beginning, and I should have, and I'll mention now, and hopefully I'll mention a few more times. It's great to use secondary sources to help you find statutes and understand them. You have to read them. And some of them are really dry, I understand, but you need to read through them and make your interpretation. Don't trust Westlaw or a secondary source to tell you what the statute says. You need to read it, just as you need to read the case to see if that yellow flag is justified. Question?
Sort of already covered this, but are we likely to encounter issues regarding like the effective date of a statute? I mean, is it something that just rarely comes about, or is that
It's possible. I couldn't really answer how often that happens or the percentages, but yeah, you definitely would want to, and the new tax overhaul is a good example. A lot of that isn't effective until 2018, so for those of us worrying about our 2017 taxes, we're not worrying about the changes yet, but when I have to file my 2018 taxes next March or April, then it is effective. So yeah, you do want to be aware. So if you did see a red flag with a public law changing, you would want to see when is it effective, and does it apply to your client?
or even like a, I don't know, is it a sunshine provision, like whenever it expires after a certain time?
Some statutes do expire. Sometimes they expire and another one takes over. Lexis and Westlaw, again, why we pay a lot of money, are pretty good about giving you warning to check. If you're not able to use Lexis and Westlaw, then you really have to read carefully. Those effective dates really only you find them in the public laws. So I wouldn't say every single statute section you look through, you would have to look at the effective, go to the last public law and look at the effective date. That would be a waste of time to do that all the time. You would want to see if there's some other reason, whether it's a signal on Lexis or Westlaw, or reading through and there seems to be in the text of the statute a date limitations. That would be a clue as to, oh, I better see what the effective date is for this. Question? Question? That answer your question? I hope. Okay, good. Okay, so those flags You want to just watch for notices on top. If we look to Lexis, what Lexis uses is Shepherd. So again, we see pending legislation, so that's not enacted. So again, means the same as proposed. We would want to shepherdize, which we will talk about next week, shepherdizing statutes to look to see if cases invalidate. And again, actually, Alex's question goes to my very emphatic update, and making sure when it is effective or whether it sunsets. Looking at updating in, actually, hold up before we look in print. So there are a couple of distinctions to make. So we have talked a lot about making sure that we are up to date. So here on Lexis, it's very straightforward. We know, for instance, that Lexis is up to date, so it's whatever public laws have happened, it's covering through, or it's current through Public Law 115-117, which was approved in January 12, 2018. I don't know if you can see this. Make it a little bigger for you. And there's a gap. Oops, that's a little too big. There's a gap of this Public 115-91. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the public law number of the new tax bill because it's just so huge. And that's why there's the gap. So we know that at least through a month ago, not even, Lexis is incorporating all of the public laws. Now, again, understand the distinction between when Lexis was updated and when the section itself is updated, and that, again, is what we already talked about with regard to history, and of course we already talked about that's the last public law back in 2006. That looks a little bit different on Westlaw. On Westlaw has this currentness link, tells you when Westlaw was last updated. So down here at the bottom, it's current through Public Law 115-90, also includes 115-92 through 115-17, and you see that public law statement. Westlaw doesn't give you a date the way Lexis does, so you'd have to find when those public law, to have an exact date, and there'd be no reason to do this. I'm not suggesting that you need to do this, but you would have, again, why you need to be familiar with the public law numbering system to understand, okay, 115 is this current Congress, and we now know, because we looked, that 122 is the most current public law passed, so you know that this is pretty current. And again, how current Westlaw is different than when the last time Section 1144 was amended, and of course that, as we know, is in 2006. So I've spent a lot more time explaining this than it would take you just to look and see, but again, you want to be aware. And then finally, doing this in print, should you have the need. Let's turn to page 33. Again, looking at the USCA, but the USCS works just the same way. You'd want to be very aware because, as it turns out, the main volume, you would see our stamp on the main volume. We received it in 2009. That doesn't necessarily mean it's copyrighted 2009, although this one is. You'd want to make sure to check the pocket part. Whatever the date of the main volume is, you always want to make sure to check the pocket part. Talk about pocket parts with treatises. They work pretty much the same way with codes. So turning the page to page 34, what you see when we look in the pocket part for Section 1144 is that there's no statutory text. It immediately goes to Law Review Journal and Commentaries. So if you're working with the print, we at least get some updated secondary sources, and then you see below that some updated notes of decisions. If we've already done the research in the main volume, then we know we're interested in topic number 192, health maintenance organizations. So turning to page 35, we see updated notes of decisions for topic 192. Again, works the same with U.S. Code Service. Does not work the same with the U.S. Code because that is not one of our BFFs. That does not have notes of decisions. So, and again, the supplement 4, is the most recent, and that only takes us to last year. There is, as far as I know of, no really great reason to use the official U.S. Code unless you need to see the law as it existed in some prior time. Sometimes your matter arose in an earlier year, and that's the applicable law, so that might be when you would want to look at the U.S. Code. It may be that the current law was applicable when your matter arose, so if your matter arose in 2010, 1144 hasn't changed since 2006, so that would still be applicable. But if your matter arose in 1992 and the statute of limitations hadn't for whatever reason, hasn't precluded you from suing, then you'd want to look at the law back in 1992, and that's when the U.S. Code would be useful. But that's going to be very rare. Yeah, question?
It would only matter if the law passed had retroactive effect, right?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Like you're talking about applicable law in 1992, but if the new law has retroactive effect, then it would matter to your case?
Yeah, that's true. Most laws tend not to look back and say the law is changing what used to be. The law usually is effective as of a certain date, or the date is passed, or a certain date, like the tax law is effective as of 2018, most of it. Again, I probably even shouldn't have spent so much time. The U.S. Code is not something for researching the current law you would have much reason to use. You would want to use an annotated code for all the reasons I mentioned, but also that it's most up to date. Okay. Other questions? So, as I mentioned, we will talk about statutes in our next class. So we are going to finish today with a more now traditional workshop on federal codes and statutes.